often in larger and higher quality projects that require a greater attention to detail, I'm hit with executive dysfunction in the final stretch. In this video, I'll be discussing that, as well as how I approach painting box art replication and why. We'll have the work on the Dankhold Troggboss, which I recently finished as a backdrop, and many other examples from my past to drive it home. I'm going to be giving out a few step-by-step pointers in this video, but we'll be touching on ADHD and executive dysfunction, where I am right now with content creation, some thoughts on going pro, commissions, competitions, and more. It might be a bit of a ramble, but it leads places, so stick with me. Weird places, maybe, I don't know. I'm Tom. People on the internet call me Mad Cat. Welcome to the channel of the Mini Mad Cat. Quick caveat, I'm not making an argument for one best method to paint miniatures. An experimentation led by your heart's desire is a must. All the advice herein doesn't stand as a critique to anyone's painting style. I've been painting a Dankhold Troggboss, part of the Gloomspike Gits faction, in Age of Sigmar for my friend patron of the arts, Gavin, to join his small army of Gits as the leader. Gav said he didn't mind how I painted it. His only concern was that I enjoyed painting it, and his joy was getting a model painted by my good self. Well, he picked a model that I've wanted to paint since it was being made up in the Games Workshop toolroom. To new subscribers, it might be news that I was an employee at Games Workshop for nearly 5 years in the factory, working on production and manufacturing of the plastic kit. I'm hit with executive dysfunction. I distinctly remember polishing parts of the mold for this kit, specifically the giant centipede being crushed by the big Troggboss fist and its squirt of vital essences. It was a challenge to clean. It was also a challenge to paint. The recesses were particularly shallow and the edge detail seemed a little rounded in places. Hopefully not from over polishing. The shape of it is rather unusual, asymmetrical, and somewhat occluded by the main body of the model in mine and the designer's defense. But hovering around all these excuses is the fact that it was the last part of the model I'd left to paint. And on big projects, with so much time often invested, when the model comes out of that hot mess stage into a looking good state, something in my mind changes. It's like a creative block, one full of mixed emotions and a wandering mental state. For one, in its state of good enough or looks finished, the subject appears less of a priority. Other jobs and tasks become overbearing. There's some desire to extend the project. Am I finding solace in somehow believing close enough is good enough? Its final parts often demand the most attention, and by now, attention on the subject is somewhat spent or waning. My best work, where any mistake becomes easier to spot the closer you get to finished, the anxiety can increase with every brushstroke. Of course, one must paint fearlessly, but fear and anxiety are not the same things.
Fear is the mind killer.
We're getting awfully deep here for a miniatures video. Fear, of course,
It's a little death that brings total obliteration.
is for present dangers, whereas anxiety comes from worrying what might happen. Shoulda, woulda, coulda. We must learn to trust in the process. Everything we do as painters is fixable. We can add more paint and take paint away, even in the last moments. Speaking of final moments, if you've painted the Dankhold Troggboss yourself, let me know in the comments down below how you found painting what I assume is his next meal. Tasty. And if you've any thoughts on my incoherent insights and inquiries I've mentioned, I'm all ears. Please keep it polite in the comments. Now, if you're a real stickler, you'll likely have already spotted this Troggboss paint job isn't a perfect replication of the heavy metal box art. Well, it wasn't intended to be. For a start, there's a gap or two I think I left, some tiny marks and texturing left from putty I didn't clean up perfectly before priming and never quite smoothed out. so it wouldn't qualify for GW box art and it would fall down in a competition from that rather a lot. This was painted for gaming with. Some of you will think I'm mad, and I undeniably am, but forget that for a moment, just hear me out. I may never paint one of these again. I'm not terminal, I'm just incredibly slow. And having helped make the model myself, I'm eager to do it justice this one time. Like I said, I'd always wanted to paint it. The moment I laid my eyes on the impression in the mold. Why do a box art study? Well, I've attempted to match or copy the box art or of other people's paint jobs numerous times in my painting journey as a way of forcing incremental improvements, whilst also removing the need for creative decision making on my part. This provides more headspace to focus on a technique for the duration of the project, as we're not distracted or slowed down by ruminating on such things as colour choice, value scale, or golden angle. In traditional art, and by extension, within our own world of miniatures, attempting reproductions or practicing a particular technique may be referred to as a study. We do a study primarily because it gives us clear end goals to achieve, that by attempting to copy a master's work, it will enforce upon us the discomfort we need to grow. And in the end, it will stand as a demonstration of where we fall short and where we excel, which, in turn, helps inform our priorities in where we choose to hone and improve. My first study was with my first set of Nurgle Plague Bearers back in 2017, using someone's Instagram post as inspiration. I can't find the original post now, but the use of purples with greens really appealed to my high colour contrast preferences early on that's only grown over time. Immediately after, feeling like I'd made substantial gains in the last study, I embarked on a guided study by Big Mech's Workshop Paint Studio's excellent Plague Drone video tutorial. I think their drones won some sort of prize, but what I do know is their guide helped me win my first miniature painting competition in June 2017. Then the month after, I placed again with a Plague Marine that was based on the Apostles of Contagion subfaction of the Death Guard that were featured in an A4 sized booklet in the 40k 8th edition box. These were my first attempt at copying box art where I had to colour match without guidance. Much later on, I found out they were meant to be bronze or brass or something, and I'd completely misinterpreted the book artist's intentions. Well, now I've a whole army of them. The faction leader was discontinued by Jim Worksup before I got to get my hands on him. I digress. In 2018, I used the box art for this beast of Nurgle as a guide, back when they still published the paints list, which made matching the tentacles easy. In 2019, I did a study on the box art of the Blood Bowl Rat Ogre and the Unmade Warband from Warcry. 2020, I replicated the Necromunda character Krotos Hark and did a grimdark tabletop study of a start collecting box of House Rizza Mechanicus, focusing most of all on the little bottles on the Magus' back and assisted by references gifted to me by Pascal Ruse. In 2021, I did a workup for the Blood Bowl Nurgle team. There was a mix study using the box art as a reference for the apparel and adapting Vince Venturella's recipe for putrid flesh from Hobby Cheating, episode 116. March 2022, I completed the Necromantic Crypt Stealers commission, which was about as close to a replication of a Blood Bowl box art as can be attained. They were the primary cause for a sit-down I had with the managers from the Heavy Metal Specialist Design Studio to inform me I'd have gotten the job I applied for with them had it not been for a transfer application from someone out of the lead heavy metal painting team. In April the same year, I finished this Necromancer, which caught the eye of the managers for the Age of Sigmar Army Painters team, leading to a job interview. My Enclave Force was based on colours found in the Talking Head scene from Fallout 2, and my favourite personal replication I'd done was this High Elf Galadriel Gladiator in the classic 1994 style, which I also did in 2023. Since then, I've painted box art myself for Modifius and for Signum Games. And even having attained box art status myself finally, after 7 years, I'll likely continue to reference or use as a study box art by others as both a guide and a way to impose restrictions that force growth where I think I can find it. At this stage, just like when I came back to the hobby in 2017, daily painting is the key. And with this project finally done, I can get back to painting again, and hopefully shed this ADHD, big project, scatterbrain funk I've been in. The first thing we should quickly establish here is what it is that defines box art for miniatures. And then move on to the study of box art, which will cover the general approach I take painting my miniatures, how I learnt it, and why this works. Box art is a phrase in the miniatures world that it's a catch-all. It just refers to the artwork published by the manufacturer for the miniature product. This usually comes in the form of a painted miniature on the front of the packaging, but sometimes comes instead as concept artwork. The primary, or arguably sole purpose of the box art is to entice the customer into a sale. It's not intended to give you a clear picture of how our model will end up looking, but I know I speak for lots of us when I say that attaining that image is an oft-coveted thing. As someone who's been able to get a little peek behind the curtain, I'm going to give you my top tips, tricks, and the tried and tested methods I've used to get it done. I'll just mention here that I'll be starting production on a how-to series, aiming to cover every aspect of the creative side of the tabletop hobby to share what I've learned. In it, I'll be covering all the basics, taking you through each subjective element up to an advanced understanding, ranging from model preparation to sculpting, colour theory and brush technique, and even commission work and going pro. For now, a quick crash course and overview from start to finish of the process I use for high-end mini painting. When you want to produce the best work you can in miniature paintwork, it's imperative that you start with a well-prepared model. First things first, give the parts of the kit a wash in lukewarm, soapy water. With injection molded plastic, it's rare that there's release agents, or oils, though it does happen. With resin kits and metal casts, it's a little bit more commonplace, and whilst you definitely shouldn't be getting 3D prints with residue left over, it's just good practice to wash any kit before the next phase. Doing so should give your paint the best chance to adhere properly to the surface of the model, because those various oils and agents will usually prevent paint from settling down and having a nice family. Sorry, I mean drying and adhering. Before gluing anything together, make sure to double check and remove all mold lines, fill any untoward gaps, and sand down rough areas before priming. If you don't, and you spot something you miss later down the line, it's far from ideal if you have to scrape the paint off a part to get at the mistake, or fill a part where you've already applied a nice shade. A bad mold line will really ruin a good paint job, and I for one have, on multiple occasions, removed them toward the end of the paint job, much to the chagrin of my Twitch viewers, and myself. It's like nails down a chalkboard the first few times, but it gets easier. That said, it's not meant to get easier, you're meant to avoid doing it. My point here is double, triple check. You can fix it if you miss it usually, but you just don't really want to have to. Scrape your mold lines, clean your model, fill your gaps. One of the most important elements, and I would say the key used as part of the heavy metal technique, the style most widely recognized as the industry standard, is highlighting and shading every detail of the sculpt so the form is easily read by the potential buyer's eyes. In order to maximize readability and the impact of highlights, whilst at the same time minimizing the amount of paint layers required, the entirety of the model is painted with a uniform value scale that starts at the mid-tone. Successive layers and glazes will push the shadows and highlights on each part and feature on the model to completion. I know this is how they do it, not just because that's how they tell us it's how they do it, but because I once got to attend a group painting session led by Max Village at GW, where he demoed it on an Astartes face. You should generally aim to start painting the parts of the model that are most recessed and hard to reach, then finish it with its extremities towards the outside. For example, this would usually mean starting with the skin, moving up to the clothing, and finishing with the held and worn objects, such as weapons, or in this case, the moments of a giant centipode's demise, or centipudicide, if you will. When attempting to copy or replicate someone else's work, if you're able to get a list of the paints used, that is ideal, but not necessary. There are lots of guides on YouTube, and there's usually a guide for the model in the faction colours you want to paint if you look enough. They'll often include a paint list at the start. This is the selection I used on this Troggboss, and all the extras. I realise it's a lot of different paints. Let me address that in a moment. Sadly, Games Workshop and Citadel Paints have removed the paint selection list from their web store, best as I can tell. The video guides they used to post to YouTube seem to me to have ceased, instead locking their tutorials behind the Warhammer Plus paywall. And that falls largely in line with the industry as a whole. They are of course the market leaders, and thus dictate the standard. As far as I know, no manufacturer is currently providing painting tutorials, but if you know of one, put it down in the comments below. This makes doing what I used to do in the past no more challenging in reality to me. However, colour matching is only easy for those who don't suffer any colour blindness and or are familiar with the finish of each of their paints. The former I'm lucky to not have, and the latter comes only with time. If you're stuck, get a picture of the box art on a paint program and use the colour picker tool. From there, you should be able to find the best matches available to you by cross-referencing the result with your favourite paint brand's line. One hint I feel compelled to mention to those not in the know: most wet paints when dry become a little darker, so pick accordingly. Don't let this be torturous. Close is good enough, as the light and shadow will ultimately be where the eye is drawn. As mentioned earlier, starting each area with a mid-tone and build your colour choice from there is generally be considered the optimal approach for heavy metal box style art. A key idea behind this is you've less paint to apply to the model by the end if you start from a mid-tone. Now, I don't always adhere to this, and I'll go into my method in a moment, but let me explain. When you start from your shadows and move up to your highlights, you're looking at 3 to 5 layers or more of paint at your peak highlight, depending on how far you take the value contrast and how many layers you need to apply of each paint to reach your desired saturation or opacity. When you start from a mid-tone, you're only 1 to 3 coats away from your highest highlights and deepest shadows, which, relative to the dark to light approach, can be significant. Lots of paint ranges offer triad sets to assist you in picking matching shadows and highlights. However, I'd encourage you to push out from thinking about triads as the best solution. Personally, with the exception of the gold non-metallic metal triad from Reaper, I don't use painting triads. And even then, when painting gold non-metallic metal, I usually make the upgrade to a quintet with black or darker brown and ivory. As we've seen, the selection I used to complete the Troggboss is pretty huge, and frankly that's just normal for me by the end of a project like this. Maybe one or two of them out of the bunch use very little, but the point is that when I'm painting, I'll grab and try colours I think will work and generally stick with them through to the end. I pick my favourite paints based on past use and how I want the final model to come out. I don't make a list at the start, but you could, and I have done before, especially when I first started, for shopping lists, for example. With this Troggboss, I started as I usually do, with my airbrush and a basic zenithal prime. We follow on with purple shadows, and then target the mushrooms with red and the barnacles with desaturated green. With that done, shading and midtones on the skin and its mycelic and sessile passengers rapidly progress towards completion. It would arguably have been easier and cleaner to paint these with a shade or a speed paint, but I enjoy extending the use of the airbrush as far into all my projects as possible, and even consider coming back with it in the middle or even for finishing touches. In this case, I'm creating tonal variation, which I can later incorporate into the skin by glazing in semi-transparent layers in some of those areas. By leaving some of the green and red showing through the skin, his mushrooms and barnacles will feel much more at home, whilst providing much relief on an otherwise overtly alabaster surface. The skin takes a long time. It's about 3/4 of the whole model, but glazing with AK's pastel violet is much like glazing with any pale, near white colour. It's sort of dusty, so I had to take lots of time on it and try and keep it as smooth as I could. We work in sections. I hit the face early on to get to the extremely tiny recessed eyes. We start red, go straight to yellow for the iris, then a black dot for the pupil and a tiny white dot inside that. After that, I add a little more purple shading to prepare for highlighting at the end along with the teeth. I used various inks, washes and contrast paints on the plate style fungus, back stalagmites, skulls, waxy ear flesh, ropes, furs, leathers, centipede and spooder, just to define them and get to know the shape of the model a little better. Using inks, washes and contrasts over the zenithal means we've got shadows and midtones already established, so most of those paints are ready to be highlighted using mixes on the palette which usually involve the midtone and either a bright yellow, ivory or white. The stalactite bat was wet blended with contrast paints and highlighted using the same sort of approach, but with pale blues and greens. The centipede, who had pterodon turquoise first, was roughly highlighted with white, then given a coat of very diluted black Templar. I gave it yet another coat, this time of Acolian green, because I wasn't happy with the finishing colour, and then proceeded to flagellate myself with the awkward shapes and placement of the highlights. I used Rogue Hobby's two new blues, I think, moving up to a pale desaturated blue, Blue Horror, and then I finally mix in a little white with that for a few single dots at the meeting points of the lines. I realised the butt stingers on the box art were a burgundy red at the last moment, and repainted mine as a burgundy that runs up to a yellow with thin ivory lines for highlight. Okay, so I've missed out the mushroom recipe. They were airbrush red to start, as I said earlier. I think I used scarlet ink through the airbrush for that. And then I cracked out the brand new Monument Hobbies Rogue Hobbies signature bismuth yellow and orange red paints for a super saturated yellow to red blend. I then used Purple Lake ink by Dale Rowney at the edges to blend out from the red base, and then used the dark turquoise from Suggs' signature line for the bright blue short striations. The spots are just black and white. One of the things I got to see become a regular part of the heavy metal style whilst I was working at Nottingham HQ, when I would go into Warhammer World and look at the heavy metal models in the cabinet, was the increasingly liberal use of extremely fine freehand line work and dots. This technique creates the illusion of a reflection from a hard glossy surface or an edge or point where the model may not have the most easy to execute definition for which to do it on. Seeing it for the first time on a model I can't remember, I knew I had to start trying more super thin freehand edge lining myself. I looked up videos for it and started integrating it into my paint jobs as often as I could. This method effectively describes the general technique of freehanding. 1. You need to load up with paint using a reasonably sized, well-pointed brush containing the right level of water moisture. Recognizing when you've got that moisture level right takes practice. This leads to the second point. You can and should practice and check on a hard surface or back of your hand or thumb that you have the right flow and opacity of paint, and practice thin lines and dots there until you're ready. Number 3. Doing it for realsies. Position the model so you'll be drawing the tip of the brush towards you. This is the easiest way to draw a nice straight line. Number 4. Repeatedly draw the line in the air whilst progressively closing in on the actual brushstroke, focusing on your starting point with your end in mind. Number 5. When you hit your first mark on the model, the key is then following through with the brushstroke, or failing that, restarting cleanly from where you left off. Number 6. Cleanup. Getting it right every time isn't worth worrying about, because, as always, you can fix any mistake and come in with the colour you painted over to trim that line up if you're careful. One of the most important things, of course, when attempting these fine freehand lines is a brush with a beautifully sharp point and a reasonable belly to hold moisture, which provides good flow. I've been using a Rosemary & Co. Series 33 size 4 for most of the model, as a change from my Artis Opus Series S size 4, which has been wonderful to experience the difference between the two. I'll be doing a video on the topic of these brushes and more very soon. Subscribe and hit the bell to get a notification when that comes out. This base was sculpted using plaster waste from the Fallout board, air-dry clay, parts from the Troggboss kit, 3D prints, micro beads and a plastic BB. The model is pinned from each foot through the sculpt into the base. We did pre-fits and checks that they would come together nicely, then painted the base separately and didn't put them together until the legs and feet were done. The water effects were done at the very end, after everything else was painted, which left just the black to paint on the rim. On box art miniatures, the base is usually understated with a simple ground cover and a tuft or two. Sometimes the model itself will have a part of the base integrated into the design through the overused tactical rock. I don't see this changing on the basis that the understated base does ultimately focus the attention on the sculpt, and GW do love a tactical rock. It seems the longer a project goes on for, the more extreme procrastination can get. I've always been able to find excuses for delaying finishing what I find myself working on. Speaking in my defense once again on this model, I had a wedding I was preparing to sing at, which I missed due to a vile cold and possibly hay fever at the same time. Somewhat resultantly, I ended up writing a song about the UK election, which I promptly released to iTunes, Apple Music, Spotify, Deezer and more. Then had the first of a few new housemates move in and needed to go through previous tenants' stuff for a much needed clean and clear out of clutter before they arrived. All that whilst deciding whether or not I should move house or not, and finally coming close to completely rearranging my room so it's a bit more divided into separate work and leisure spaces. I got distracted. Got all that other stuff attended to though. I heard they call that executive dysfunction. What do you think? Oh, and I didn't move my room around, although I might be that the next video's backdrop will be completely different. Well, I love high color contrast, micro details, and reaching a similar peak value in highlights and shadows across the model. I've adopted much of that from copying box art. I personally prefer higher saturation in my art, though I do love me some grimdark. And whilst I understand the muted tones found in most wargamer paints lend themselves well to that aesthetic, I just think When you can pick a colour that really kicks people's eyes in their faces, then why the hell not, eh? I just wanted to take things a little further on the mushrooms, make the skin a little pinker, and put him in the cave environment he so greatly deserves. I'm not saying my paint job is better than the heavy metal one. In fact, I think I've probably made it pretty clear that I say that it's not, but it's a bit rough compared to their smoother finish for sure. But I prefer mine now it's finished. And whilst I'm surrounded by lovely folk who are awfully encouraging, I've been believing them when they say they prefer it too. If you're new to the hobby, or you're looking to level up your painting, and you've never tried a study before, then give it a go and let me know how you get on. If you'd like to see full painting processes, get unlimited access to my 7 years of sagely painting advice, see all the materials I use and get the advanced painting series that I'm planning, then join the Patreon. To keep yourself up to date with what I'm up to, you can join the Discord, where you can get links and notifications to live streams when they start, join in on voice channels when I'm around, take part in community posts and more. I'm sorry for the long break in uploads and for not having live stream in a while. I needed this time to write this script and kind of figure out what I'm doing next, because things are not perfect. Anyway, this video should clarify a little why it's been like that, and I hope to see you all again soon. I'm the Mini Mad Cat, question everything and have fun. A greater attention to detail. I'm hit with executive dysfunction. Dysfunction, fine. Okay. Fucking hell.